Blood dries sticky, like cheap syrup, but desert sand quickly turns it into a rigid crust. Quinn scraped a chipped thumbnail against the hardened black ridge on her knuckle, only half listening to the two-star general currently screaming himself into a purple-faced stroke. He pointed a manicured, trembling finger at the tarnished gold trident stitched to her plate carrier. Stolen valor, he called it. A disgrace. Quinn didn't argue, nor did she deliver a heroic rebuttal. She just wanted a shower, and maybe a cigarette. 72 hours. That was how long Quinn had been lying, in a crevice of shattered concrete and rebar that smelled acutely of feral dogs and pulverized drywall. Her muscles had forgotten how to fully extend. Every step she took, across the sun-blistered tarmac of Forward Operating Base Kodiak, felt like tearing old scar tissue. She walked with the heavy, uneven gait of someone who had carried too much weight for too long. Her custom-fitted rifle, wrapped in ragged burlap and dust-caked tape, was slung across her back. It dug a familiar, bruised trench into her collarbone. She didn't adjust it. Pain was just data, and right now, her brain was filtering it out, along with the blinding glare of the midday sun. The FOB was a hive of frantic, useless energy. Supply trucks groaned over speed bumps, fresh-faced infantrymen, their uniforms still bearing the stiff creases of the factory, hurried between air-conditioned tents. They smelled of laundry detergent and cheap energy drinks. Quinn smelled of dried urine, rancid sweat, and the coppery tang of spent brass. She walked through them like a ghost drifting through the living. They parted for her, eyes dropping to the dust, repelled by the sheer, localized gravity of her exhaustion. Her lips were cracked, bleeding sluggishly into the corner of her mouth. She tasted salt. She tasted the grit of the Shamal wind that had howled through the valley 2 nights ago. But mostly, she tasted the metallic, stale adrenaline that still coated the back of her throat. Quinn pushed through the heavy vinyl flaps of the Tactical Operations Center. The rush of aggressively cooled air hit her like a physical blow. Her sinuses seized. The TOC was dim, lit by the sickly blue glow of monitors and harsh overhead fluorescence that emitted a high-pitched electronic whine. To Quinn, whose hearing had been tuned to the absolute silence of a sniper's hide, the hum was deafening. She blinked, her vision swimming for a fraction of a second as her pupils contracted. Gallagher, a voice murmured from the shadows. It was Commander Riley. He was leaning over a topographical map, a half-empty mug of black coffee in his hand. Riley looked like a man who hadn't slept a full night since 2018. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. "Target package neutralized," Quinn said. Her voice sounded like 2 rocks grinding together. She didn't salute. SEALs rarely did in the field, and she currently lacked the physical energy to raise her arm above her chest. "Confirmed?" Riley asked softly. "I left half his skull on the steering wheel of his Toyota," Quinn replied, staring blankly at a spot on the plywood wall. "Confirmation is sitting in the dirt." Riley nodded slowly. He didn't smile. There was no celebration, just the grim acknowledgement of a dirty chore completed. "Go get cleaned up, Quinn. Medical first, then rack out." She turned to leave. She just had to make it 300 yards to the showers. 300 yards of putting one foot in front of the other. Then the vinyl flaps of the TOC tore open, letting in a blinding wedge of sunlight. General Clayton stepped into the room. He brought the scent of expensive aftershave and bureaucratic authority with him. He was flanked by 2 nervous-looking aides, their eyes darting around the room. Clayton was a man who belonged behind a mahogany desk in the Pentagon, not in the gritty reality of a forward operating base. His uniform was immaculate. The camouflage pattern was crisp, the colors vivid, completely devoid of the beige, powdery dust that coated everything and everyone else in Kodiak. His boots caught the fluorescent light, polished to a dull, obsessive shine. "Commander," Clayton barked, his voice booming in the quiet hum of the TOC. It was a voice trained to project across conference rooms, utterly lacking the hushed modulation of people who lived within earshot of mortar fire. Riley straightened, setting his mug down. "General Clayton, we weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "Schedules change, Riley. Insurgents don't work on our timetable, and neither do I," Clayton said, scanning the room with a look of generalized distaste. His eyes swept past the analysts, past the radio operators, and finally snagged on Quinn. She was standing near the exit, her hand resting against the plywood frame to keep her balance. Her helmet was off, hanging by its chin strap from her rig. Her hair, chopped jaggedly to her chin, was plastered to her skull with sweat and grease. Her face was painted in tiger stripes of grime, soot, and the pale streaks where sweat had carved rivers through the dirt. Clayton's eyes dropped from her face to her chest. Sewn into the center of her faded, frayed plate carrier, just above her magazine pouches, was a patch. The eagle holding the anchor, trident, and flintlock pistol. The seal trident. Clayton's face tightened. The color began to rise from his starched collar, creeping up his neck like a rash. "You!" Clayton snapped, pointing directly at Quinn. "What the hell is that?" Quinn blinked slowly. Her brain was currently operating on a severe delay. She looked down at her own chest, then back up at the general. "It's a chest rig, sir." "Don't play stupid with me, specialist." Clayton's voice climbed an octave, bouncing off the low ceiling. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He stopped just outside her personal space, glaring down at her. He smelled overwhelmingly of peppermint and starch. It made Quinn nauseous. "That badge," Clayton hissed, his finger now inches from her sternum. "You can't wear that badge. Who do you think you are? What unit are you attached to, soldier?" "I'm not a soldier, sir," Quinn said quietly. "I'm a sailor." "I don't care if you're the Pope," Clayton roared. The TOC went completely silent. The analysts stopped typing. Even the hum of the servers seemed to dial back. "That is a special warfare insignia. It is earned through blood, sweat, and tears by the toughest men on this god-forsaken planet. It is not a fashion accessory you slap on your vest because you think it looks badass." Quinn felt a dull throb behind her left eye. A migraine was blooming, spreading its roots down the back of her neck. She didn't feel angry. She just felt an overwhelming, bone-deep weariness. She looked at the man's hands. Soft. No calluses. No burns from hot brass. No ingrained dirt under the cuticles. "Take it off," Clayton commanded, holding out his hand. "Rip it off that vest right now, or I will have you brought up on Article 134 so fast your head will spin. Stolen valor is a federal offense, you pathetic general." Riley's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a razor blade. He stepped out from behind the map table, moving deliberately. Clayton whipped his head around. "Keep out of this, Commander. You have a garrison trooper parading around in a SEAL trident. This is a breakdown of discipline on your watch." "She's not a garrison trooper, sir," Riley said evenly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet gravity in his tone was heavier than all of Clayton's shouting. "And she's not wearing stolen valor." Clayton scoffed, a wet, ugly sound. "Oh, really? You expect me to believe this? This little girl made it through BUD/S. That she earned the right to wear the Budweiser?" He turned back to Quinn, his lips curling in a sneer. "Look at her. She looks like a stiff breeze would knock her over." Quinn shifted her weight. Her knee popped loudly in the quiet room. She looked at Clayton with dead, flat eyes, the kind of eyes that had watched human lives end through a glass lens from a mile away. There was no defiance in her gaze, no cinematic glare, just a hollow, terrifying emptiness. "My ears are ringing, sir," Quinn said, her voice barely a whisper. "Could you please stop yelling?" Clayton's mouth opened, a torrent of abuse ready to spill out, but he froze when he actually looked into her eyes. Something primitive in his brain misfired. He saw the predator's void staring back at him, wrapped in the fragile shell of an exhausted woman. "General, step into my office," Riley said. It wasn't a request. Clayton puffed out his chest, trying to recover the momentum he had just lost to a dirty, sleep-deprived ghost. "I will not. I want her reprimanded here and now. I want to see her personnel file. I want her DD-214, her deployment orders, and the name of whatever idiot supply clerk let her walk out with that patch." Riley sighed. He rubbed a hand over his face, sounding almost as tired as Quinn looked. "Fine. You want to do this here? We'll do it here." Riley walked over to the secure SIPRnet terminal in the corner of the room. The keyboard clacked loudly as he entered his credentials. The silence in the TOC was thick, oppressive. The aides standing near the door looked like they wanted to sink into the floorboards. Quinn just leaned against the wall. She closed her eyes. She could feel the vibration of the generator humming through the plywood and into her boots. It was soothing, in a sick way, reminded her of the vibration of a helicopter deck. A printer in the corner whirred to life. It spat out 3 pages of thick, classified paper. Riley snatched them from the tray and walked back to the center of the room. He didn't hand them to Clayton. He slammed them down onto the topographical map, right on top of the region they were currently occupying. "Read it, General," Riley said softly. Clayton glared at him, then looked down at the documents. He picked them up with a sharp, irritated motion. "What is this? Her fantasy camp certificate?" "That is Chief Petty Officer Quinn Gallagher's jacket," Riley said. "Or at least, the unredacted summary I am legally allowed to show a man with your clearance level." Clayton snorted and began to read. For the first 10 seconds, his expression was pure, condescending skepticism. Then his brow furrowed. He blinked, bringing the paper closer to his face, as if the tiny black font had suddenly morphed into a foreign language. The color that had been boiling in his face slowly began to drain away, starting at his cheeks and leaving a sickly, pale yellow behind. The room waited. The only sound was the rustle of the heavy paper as Clayton turned to the second page. His breathing changed. The aggressive huffs through his nose became shallow, irregular intakes of air. Quinn didn't open her eyes. She knew what was on those pages. She lived with the weight of it every time she closed her eyes. It wasn't just the BUD/S graduation date, Class 334, the one where they had to pull 3 men out of the surf with hypothermia. The one where she had fractured 2 ribs during log PT and taped them tight so the instructors wouldn't see. It wasn't just the sniper qualification scores, which sat comfortably in the top 1 percentile of naval special warfare history. It was the ledger. The cold, bureaucratic tabulation of human lives ended. Clayton's eyes scanned down the rows. Coast province, distance 1,120 meters. Crosswind 8 knots. Target, high value. Confirmed. Helmand, distance 850 meters. Moving target in vehicle. Confirmed. Al-Anbar, 72-hour overwatch. 4 hostile snipers neutralized. Confirmed. He turned to the third page. His hands were shaking now, just a microscopic tremor, but enough to rattle the stiff paper. "Page 3, General," Riley whispered. "Look at the date, last Tuesday." Clayton's eyes dropped to the bottom entry. Operation Broken Anvil. Extraction of pinned Army Ranger Unit, 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company. Hostile combatants engaged. 24. Range 400 to 1,400 meters. Ammunition expended 28 rounds. Confirmed kills 22. Clayton swallowed hard. The silence in the TOC was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a mausoleum. He looked up from the paper, his eyes wide, the arrogance completely stripped from his features. Charlie Company, last Tuesday. Clayton's own nephew was a lieutenant in Charlie Company. The kid had called him from a sat phone on Wednesday, crying, talking about how they had been trapped in a wadi by DSHK machine gun fire, waiting to die. The kid had said an angel in the hills had systematically dismantled the ambush, dropping heavy machine gunners before they could even rack their bolts. Clayton slowly turned his head to look at Quinn. She was still leaning against the plywood, her eyes closed. A fresh drop of blood welled up from her cracked lip, running down her chin and dripping onto the Kevlar of her vest. It landed right next to the tarnished gold trident. 22, Clayton breathed out, the number catching in his throat. It wasn't just a number. It was a massacre orchestrated by a single human being, a terrifying, godlike application of violence. He looked at her hands. The ones he had thought were soft. Now, looking closer, he saw the deep, permanent grease burns on her knuckles, the calluses on her trigger finger that looked like hardened leather. He saw the way she stood, not with the rigidity of a parade ground soldier, but with the loose, coiled tension of a coiled spring. "You," Clayton started, his voice barely a croak. "You were the overwatch for Charlie Company." Quinn finally opened her eyes. They were grey, the colour of winter ice, and utterly exhausted. "They were good kids," she rasped. "They kept their heads down when I told them to on the radio." Clayton looked back at the papers, then at the dirt-streaked woman in front of him. The patch on her chest didn't look like a fashion accessory anymore. It looked like a warning label. He slowly lowered the papers to the table. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, uncomfortable humility, the realization that he, with his stars and his polished boots, was a tourist in a hell she lived in every single day. "Chief," Clayton said, his voice trembling slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to find his command presence, but it was gone. I apologize." Quinn didn't smile. She didn't gloat. The apology meant nothing to her. It didn't bring back the ringing in her ears, and it didn't wash the smell of copper out of her nose. "Sir," she said softly, peeling herself off the wall, "if you're done shouting at me, I really need to take a shower." Without waiting for his dismissal, she turned and pushed her way back out through the vinyl flaps, stepping back into the blinding heat of the desert, leaving the general standing in the cold blue light of her ledger. Gravel crunched beneath her boots, a rhythmic, agonizing sound that seemed to echo directly inside her skull. The walk to the ablution blocks was a straight line across the sun-baked dirt, but Quinn navigated it like a drunk walking a tightrope. Every muscle fiber in her thighs and lower back screamed in protest, locked in the rigid tension of a 3-day prone position. Shower Trailer 3 was a corrugated metal shipping container, retrofitted with PVC piping and cheap plywood dividers. It smelled intensely of bleach, standing water, and the cheap pine soap favoured by the supply clerks. To Quinn, it was the closest thing to a sanctuary on the entire continent. She pushed the heavy metal door open. The hinges shrieked, protesting the ever-present grit. Inside, the air was a thick, humid soup that instantly coated her lungs. A solitary figure was at the far end of the trailer, a female mechanic from the motor pool, scrubbing grease from her forearms with a stiff, bristled brush. The woman glanced up, saw the mud-caked, feral-looking apparition standing in the doorway, and immediately looked back down, offering a silent, respectful nod. Quinn didn't nod back. She didn't have the cervical mobility for it. She simply shuffled to the nearest stall, pulled the flimsy, mildew-spotted vinyl curtain shut, and began the arduous process of dismantling her armor. Taking off gear after a long op was a specific kind of torture. Her fingers, stiff and numb, fumbled with the heavy plastic buckles of her chest rig. When she finally popped the clasps, the sudden release of 30 pounds of plates, magazines, and radio equipment made her stagger forward. The rig hit the slatted wooden floorboard with a heavy, metallic thud. Next was the combat shirt. The fabric was practically fused to her skin by layers of dried sweat and pulverized brick dust. She grabbed the hem and pulled. It peeled away with a sound like ripping tape, taking tiny hairs and a layer of dead skin with it. The cold air of the trailer hit her bare torso, making her shiver violently despite the ambient heat. She turned on the water. It sputtered out of the corroded showerhead, coughing up a burst of rusty brown liquid before settling into a weak, lukewarm trickle. Quinn stepped under it. The water hit the back of her neck, and for a terrifying, fleeting second, her legs almost gave out. She grabbed the slick fiberglass wall of the stall, her knuckles turning white, and forced her knees to lock. The runoff pooling at her feet turned instantly black. It was a slurry of charcoal, sand, and camouflage face paint. She watched it swirl toward the drain, mesmerizing and disgusting. Slowly the water began to run brown, then a hazy, diluted red. She looked down at her hands. The knuckles on her right hand were split and bleeding sluggishly, a souvenir from racking the heavy bolt of her rifle in a frantic split-second reload when the crosswind had shifted in coast. A massive purple-black bruise bloomed across her right shoulder and collarbone, perfectly tracing the outline of her rifle's buttstock. It was the physical receipt for 28 rounds of .338 Lapua Magnum. Quinn grabbed a half-melted bar of industrial soap from the wire rack. It smelled like raw lye. She scrubbed it aggressively over her arms, her chest, her face, trying to erase the physical evidence of the last 72 hours. The soap stung the micro-abrasions covering her skin, a sharp, chemical bite that finally cut through the foggy numbness in her brain. She closed her eyes and let the lukewarm water pound against her eyelids. But the darkness behind her eyes wasn't empty. A steering wheel, the smell of cheap tobacco, the dull metallic pop of a skull fracturing under a high-velocity impact. Her eyes snapped open. She gasped, sucking in a lungful of bleach-scented steam, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Panic was a useless emotion. Fear was a liability. She had trained her brain to compartmentalize these things, to lock them in tiny, reinforced boxes at the back of her mind. But water always found the cracks. Quinn leaned her forehead against the cool fiberglass wall, forcing her breathing to slow. In through the nose, count to 4. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth for 4. The tactical breathing exercise felt mechanical, hollow, but it worked. Her heart rate decelerated. The trembling in her fingers subsided into a dull ache. She finished washing in silence. The mechanic had left. The only sound was the weak sputter of the showerhead and the distant, muffled thump of a transport helicopter lifting off from the flight line. Drying off was another chore. The towel was scratchy, practically made of sandpaper, and it snagged on the fresh scabs along her forearms. She pulled on a clean, oversized olive-drab t-shirt and a pair of faded gym shorts. Without the rigid support of her boots and body armor, she felt horrifyingly fragile, like a hermit crab yanked from its shell. She bundled her filthy uniform into a tight roll, picked up her heavy rig, and pushed back out into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat immediately began to evaporate the dampness from her hair, stiffening the strands into awkward, spiky clumps. As she walked toward the housing units, a pair of young infantrymen passed her. They were laughing about something, their voices loud and carefree. One of them, a corporal with a fresh buzz cut, bumped her shoulder as he walked by. "Watch it, contractor," he muttered, not even looking back. Quinn didn't stop. She didn't correct him. Without her uniform, without the tarnished gold trident, she was invisible to them. Just a pale, bruised woman in a baggy t-shirt carrying a heavy bag of dirty laundry. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was her trade. The less they saw her, the less she existed. And right now, not existing sounded like a luxury. Containerized Housing Unit 42 was an oven. The small air conditioning unit bolted to the window struggled heroically, rattling and coughing out a weak stream of cool air that barely penetrated the stifling heat trapped within the metal walls. Quinn dropped her gear in the corner with a heavy sigh. The small room contained a metal cot, a thin foam mattress, a plywood desk, and a standing locker. It was entirely devoid of personality. No photos taped to the walls, no civilian books on the desk. It looked exactly like what it was, a temporary storage locker for a human weapon. She sat on the edge of the cot. The springs groaned underneath her. Sleep was the objective. That was what Riley had ordered. Rack out. But her nervous system hadn't received the memo. Her blood was still saturated with cortisol and leftover adrenaline. She laid back against the scratchy wool blanket, staring up at the water stains on the low ceiling. The silence of the room was oppressive. Out in the hide, silence meant safety. It meant she was concealed. Here, the silence was just a vacuum waiting to be filled. Her right index finger twitched, just a microscopic flexion of the tendon. "Squeeze, don't pull." The instructor's voice echoed from a decade ago. She turned onto her side, pulling her knees up toward her chest, trying to make herself smaller. The massive bruise on her shoulder throbbed in time with her heartbeat. It was the math that always kept her awake, not the faces. She rarely saw the faces clearly enough for them to haunt her. They were just pixels in a thermal scope, or blurry shapes through the mirage of heat rising off the desert floor. It was the math that lingered. Distance, wind speed, barometric pressure, the Coriolis effect, the curvature of the Earth. She had spent 3 days performing advanced calculus in her head, predicting the exact trajectory of a 250-grain bullet traveling at 3,000 feet per second. And then there was the other math, the ledger. General Clayton had seen a number on a piece of classified paper. 22. To him, it was a shocking statistic, a brutal data point that validated her existence and justified her insolence. To Quinn, it wasn't a number. It was 22 distinct mechanical actions, 22 deep breaths, 22 precise applications of pressure to a trigger sear, 22 tiny, violent recoils punching into her shoulder. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyelids until sparks of static exploded in her vision. They were good kids, she had told the general. The Rangers trapped in the wadi. She remembered the radio chatter in her earpiece, the panic, the desperate calls for air support that was grounded by the dust storm. The sound of a 19-year-old kid crying because a DSHK round had just turned his radio man into pink mist. She had clamped down on that panic, isolating her empathy in a cold, dark box. She had dialed in her dope. She had found the machine gun nest tucked into a rocky outcropping 1,200 meters away. She had fired, and fired, and fired. She didn't feel like a hero for saving those boys. She felt like a janitor who had been forced to clean up a particularly gruesome spill. A sharp knock on the metal door ripped her out of the memory. Her entire body flinched, her hand instinctively reaching for the empty space on her right hip, where her sidearm usually rested. "Yeah," she croaked, her voice dry. The door clicked open, and Commander Riley stepped in. He closed it quickly behind him to keep the meager cold air from escaping. He was holding a styrofoam clamshell box and 2 cans of lukewarm soda. "Figured you'd skip the chow hall," Riley said, his voice low and quiet. He pulled up the single folding chair and sat down near the foot of her cot. "Not hungry," Quinn muttered, sitting up slowly. Her muscles had already begun to stiffen into concrete. "Eat anyway," Riley said, tossing the clamshell onto her mattress. It landed with a soft thump. "It's chicken, or something adjacent to chicken. It has calories. You need them." Quinn stared at the styrofoam box for a long moment, before finally reaching out and popping it open. Dry, overcooked chicken breast, a scoop of instant mashed potatoes that looked like drywall paste, and soggy green beans. She picked up the plastic spork and poked at the potatoes. "Clayton's gone," Riley said after a minute of silence. He cracked open a soda and took a sip, wincing at the lack of carbonation. "Got onto a Blackhawk about 20 minutes ago, headed back to Bagram." "Good," Quinn said around a mouthful of dry chicken. It tasted like ash, but she forced herself to chew and swallow. "He's putting you up for a Silver Star, Quinn," Riley said, watching her carefully. "For the Charlie Company Overwatch." Quinn stopped chewing. She stared at the pale green wall of the CHU, a silver star, a little piece of ribbon and metal to pin on her dress uniform, right next to the trident. Another heavy thing to wear. "I don't want it," she said softly. "I know you don't," Riley sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But you're going to get it. He needs to give it to you. Makes him feel better about yelling at the woman who saved his nephew." "It wasn't a rescue," Quinn said, her voice flattening into that emotionless, deadened tone she used during debriefings. "It was target practice. They lined up in a defilade and forgot to check the high ground. Stupidity killed them, not me." Riley leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at her not as a commander, but as someone who carried the same invisible, suffocating weight. "Quinn, look at me." She slowly shifted her gaze to him. Her grey eyes were hollow, rimmed with dark, bruised exhaustion. "You did your job," Riley said, his voice stripped of all military formality. "You brought 22 of our guys home. Let the top brass hand out their little medals. Let them pat themselves on the back. But don't you dare sit here and turn yourself into a monster." "I'm not a monster, Commander," Quinn said, looking back down at the styrofoam box. She traced the edge of the spork against the plastic. "Monsters don't exist. It's just people doing terrible things to other people." Riley didn't have an argument for that. There was no argument. It was the fundamental truth of their existence, stripped of all the patriotic branding and recruitment posters. "Get some sleep, Chief," Riley said finally, standing up. He left the second soda on the desk. "You're off rotation for the next 48. Mandatory downtime. Don't make me post a guard outside your door to keep you from going to the armory." "I won't," she promised, though it sounded weak. Riley nodded, paused at the door as if he wanted to say something else, and then thought better of it. He stepped out, the latch clicking solidly shut behind him. Quinn was alone again. She took one more bite of the food, felt her stomach rebel against the texture, and pushed the box away. She lay back down, pulling the scratchy blanket up to her chin. The air conditioner rattled. The distant thud of artillery echoed from the valley miles away. She closed her eyes. Crosswind 8 knots, distance 1,120 meters. The math began again. Quinn lay perfectly still in the stifling dark, waiting for the ghosts to settle, waiting for a sleep that she knew, with absolute certainty, would not bring her any peace. Dust never truly settled in Kodiak. It merely migrated. It coated the inside of Quinn's mouth like cheap flour when she finally woke. 14 hours had passed in a blink of dark, dreamless void, but her body didn't feel rested. It felt as if it had been beaten with rubber hoses while she slept. She swung her legs over the edge of the metal cot, her feet hitting the plywood floor. Her knees popped, a sharp, dry sound in the quiet room. When she rolled her right shoulder, a deep, fibrous, tearing sensation shot down her bicep. The bruise had blossomed overnight, shifting from an angry purple to a sickly, mottled yellow-black that spread halfway down her chest. Quinn didn't look in the small plastic mirror hanging above the sink. She knew what was there. Instead, she reached under the cot and pulled out the heavy Pelican case. She needed to clean the rifle. It was a compulsion. The weapon was an extension of her own nervous system, and right now it was choked with carbon and grit. The FOB armory was a reinforced concrete bunker buried under sandbags and HESCO barriers. It was the only place in the camp that was perpetually 65 degrees. Walking inside was like stepping into a subterranean vault. The air was heavy, practically flammable, thick with the sharp, astringent odor of Hopper's No. 9 solvent, aerosolized CLP, and the dull, metallic tang of cold steel. Quinn found an empty workbench in the back corner, far away from the cage where the regular infantry turned in their issued M4s. She popped the latches on her case. The custom-built .338 Lapua Magnum lay broken down in the custom-cut foam. It wasn't a pretty weapon. The chassis was scratched and gouged, the barrel wrapped in frayed, dust-caked heat tape. It was an ugly, brutally efficient machine designed for one singular, terrible purpose. She began to strip it. Her fingers moved with blind muscle memory. She pushed the rear takedown pin, separated the upper and lower receivers, and slid the massive bolt carrier group out. The steel was coated in a thick, gritty sludge of black carbon and microscopic brass shavings. She grabbed a cotton patch, soaked it in copper solvent, and pushed it through the bore with a cleaning rod. The smell of ammonia spiked in her sinuses, sharp and aggressive, clearing away the lingering fog of sleep. She scrubbed the bolt face with a brass-bristled brush. The repetitive scraping sound was deeply rhythmic. It made sense. Metal, friction, solvent, action and reaction. It was clean math, entirely divorced from the messy, bleeding reality of what the machine actually did. Footsteps echoed on the concrete ramp leading into the bunker. Quinn didn't look up, keeping her eyes fixed on the carbon scraping off the extractor claw. 2 young men walked up to the nearby supply cage. Army Rangers. Quinn recognized the tan boots and the specific, exhausted slump of their shoulders. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been older than 20, had his left arm immobilized in a heavy sling. The white bandages wrapping his bicep were stained with the yellowish-brown bloom of dried betadine. The other kid looked jumpy, his eyes darting around the dim armory as if he expected a mortar shell to drop through the ceiling. "I'm telling you, Dawson, it was a ghost," the jumpy one said, leaning heavily against the chain-link fence of the cage. He dragged a hand through his closely cropped hair. 1 second, the DSHK is chewing up our berm, dropping suppressing fire so thick we couldn't even raise our heads. Next second, the gunner's head is just a canoe, popped like a melon. Quinn's hand went completely still. The brass brush hovered a fraction of an inch above the bolt carrier. Dawson, the kid with the sling, grimaced and shifted his weight. "Yeah, Barnes, I was there. I caught the shrapnel from the ricochet, remember?" "We didn't even hear the shots at first," Barnes continued, his voice tight, leaking the frantic, leftover adrenaline of surviving a near-death experience. "Just the impacts. Thwack, thwack, heavy caliber, had to be a mile out." LT got on the radio, and command said they had a SEAL overwatch element up in the ridgeline. Some Tier 1 psycho just picking them off. 22 drops in a zero-vis sandstorm. You know what kind of guy you gotta be to pull that off? "A cold one," Dawson muttered. Quinn stared down at her hands. The knuckles were raw, the fingernails packed with black grease. She felt entirely detached from her own body, a spectator hovering a few feet away. Some Tier 1 psycho. What kind of guy? She was right here. The ghost was sitting 15 feet away, scrubbing carbon off a firing pin with bruised, trembling hands. Dawson turned his head, scanning the armory for the supply sergeant. His eyes landed on Quinn. He saw a woman in a faded, oversized grey t-shirt and loose gym shorts, her hair a jagged, unwashed mess, her face completely void of expression. He didn't see the apex predator that had saved his life. He saw a maintenance tech. "Hey, Chief," Dawson called out, reading the anchor insignia pinned to her ball cap resting on the bench. He walked over, wincing as the movement jostled his wounded arm. "You guys got any of the new PEQ-15 lasers back here?" Supply tent said to check with the squids. Quinn looked up at him. His eyes were bloodshot. Up close, he smelled of sweat, cheap antibacterial soap, and the sour, undeniable scent of recent trauma. He was a kid. He should have been in college, worrying about midterms, not standing in a concrete bunker in a desert, bleeding through his bandages. "Check the cage in the back," Quinn said, her voice dry, raspy from sleep and lack of use. Sergeant First Class Rhodes usually hoards the new optics in the locker by the door. "Thanks," Dawson said, offering a weak, lopsided smile. He glanced down at the workbench. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the massive, terrifying dimensions of the broken-down rifle. "Jesus, look at the size of that bolt. Custom build?" "Yes," Quinn said flatly. "Heavy hitter," Dawson whistled low. "You the armorer for the SEAL teams?" "Something like that," she replied, picking up her cleaning rod and pushing a fresh, dry patch through the barrel. "Well, if you see the guy who was running Overwatch for Charlie Company last Tuesday," Dawson said, his voice dropping slightly, turning serious and deeply earnest. Tell him Dawson says thanks. Tell him he pulled us out of the fire." Quinn pulled the rod out. The white patch was stained entirely black. "I'll pass it along," she said, not looking at him. Dawson tapped his good hand on her workbench in a gesture of thanks and walked back to his buddy. They got their gear and left, their heavy boots echoing up the ramp. When the metal door clanged shut, Quinn set the rod down. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't fit the bolt back into the receiver. She sat back on the metal stool, gripping the edge of the workbench until her knuckles turned white, breathing in the toxic fumes of the solvent to keep herself from coming apart. They needed the ghost. They needed the myth of the cold-blooded mechanical killer. It made the chaotic, random violence of the valley feel structured. It made them feel like someone, somewhere, was in control. If they knew the truth, if they knew the ghost was just a thoroughly broken woman who couldn't sleep because she couldn't stop calculating the windage of her own nightmares, it would ruin the illusion. She picked up the bolt, forced her hands to steady, and slammed it home. The test range was 3 miles outside the wire of FOB Kodiak. situated in a shallow depression of cracked earth and sun-bleached rocks that the locals called the Anvil. By 1400 hours, the ambient temperature was hovering around 112 degrees. Quinn drove out in a beat-up Polaris RZR buggy. The roll cage was rusted, and the suspension whined over every rut in the dirt road. The hot wind whipped her hair against her face, drying the sweat on her skin before it could even bead. She needed to confirm her zero. After 3 days in the dirt and the chaotic extraction, she had to know the optic hadn't shifted. A millimeter of movement on the scope rings meant missing by 3 feet at 1,000 yards. She parked the buggy behind a dirt berm, hauled her Pelican case out, and unrolled her shooting mat directly onto the baked clay. The heat radiating from the ground was physical, a heavy blanket that pressed against her chest. She lay down, settling her weight into the familiar, prone position. The bruised tissue on her shoulder screamed as she pulled the heavy stock of the rifle deep into the pocket of her collarbone. She ignored it. Pain was a secondary channel. She turned it down. Quinn flipped up the scope caps and dialed the magnification up to 24. 1,000 yards downrange, a rusted, white-painted steel silhouette stood against the backdrop of a sandy ridge. Through the glass, the target didn't look solid. The extreme heat of the desert floor caused the air to boil, creating a violent, rippling mirage. The steel plate seemed to dance and waver, bending like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. It was a hallucination of physics. The target was exactly where it was supposed to be, but the environment was lying to her eyes. She had to shoot through the lie. A second engine groaned over the rise. Quinn didn't take her eye off the glass. She knew the sound of the engine. She recognized the heavy, deliberate crunch of the boots walking up behind her. Wind is full value, right to left, pulsing between 6 and 9 knots. A deep, gravelly voice said. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hayes dropped a heavy canvas bag onto the dirt next to her and lowered his massive frame to the ground. Hayes was her spotter, her shadow, and arguably the only person on the continent who actually knew her. He was built like a cinder block wall, with a thick beard and hands that looked like baseball mitts. He smelled intensely of spearmint, chewing tobacco, and dried sweat. Hayes unfolded a high-powered spotting scope on a tiny tripod and leaned into the eyepiece. "Mirage is boiling hard, Gallagher. You're shooting through soup." "I see it," Quinn whispered. Her voice was automatically quiet, slipping into the hushed, measured tone she used inside the hide. "Send it when you're ready," Hayes said, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into an empty water bottle. Quinn settled her breathing. Inhale, exhale, pause at the bottom of the breath. The natural respiratory pause. For exactly 2 seconds, her heartbeat stabilized, her chest stopped moving, and she became entirely still. She applied 2.5 pounds of pressure to the curved metal trigger. The rifle violently broke the silence. The report of the 338 Lapua was a physical concussion. A massive fireball erupted from the muzzle brake, kicking up a harsh, V-shaped cloud of dust on either side of the barrel. The recoil punched backward, slamming into Quinn's already pulverized shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer. Her entire body rocked backward an inch. She kept her eye locked inside the scope, fighting the recoil to watch her own trace. The visible distortion of the air caused by the bullet's supersonic wake. 3 seconds passed. Clang. A dull, distant ring of steel drifted back across the desert. "Impact," Hayes grunted, not moving from his scope. "Center mass, maybe half an inch right of the painted cross. Your zero is perfectly fine, Quinn. Stop punishing yourself." Quinn racked the bolt backward. The heavy steel lug slid open, ejecting a smoking brass casing onto the dirt. It landed near her elbow, hissing faintly as the superheated metal burned a tiny black ring into the canvas mat. She didn't chamber another round. She just lay there, the smell of burnt gunpowder filling her nose. It smelled like sulfur and burnt ozone. "FOB is buzzing," Hayes said casually, keeping his eye on the empty desert. "Supply guys are saying Clayton threw a tantrum in the TOC, tried to rip your Budweiser off your chest, and then Riley showed him your jacket." "Rumors," Quinn said flatly. "Did he wet himself?" Hayes asked, glancing over at her. "Tell me he wet his starched little pants, Quinn." "He just stopped yelling," she said, staring at the empty chamber of her rifle. "Riley told him about Charlie Company, about the number." Hayes sighed, a heavy, scraping sound. He rolled onto his back, pulling his cap down to shield his eyes from the blinding sun. "Right. And now you're out here in 112 degrees, beating your shoulder into hamburger meat because you're trying to outrun it. I just needed to confirm 0. "Bullshit," Hayes said softly. He didn't sound angry. He sounded deeply sad. "I've known you since Coronado, Gallagher. I watched you carry boats on your head until your scalp bled. You do this every time the number gets high. You retreat into the machine." "The machine works," Quinn said. "The machine makes sense. You account for gravity, you account for wind, you press the trigger, and a very specific outcome happens. It's clean. Killing 22 people in 3 days isn't clean, Quinn," Hayes said, sitting up. He looked down at her. His eyes were dark, serious. "It's a slaughter. It's dirty, and it's heavy, and it breaks the human brain. You're allowed to be broken by it." "I'm not broken," she snapped, a sudden sharp spike of defensive anger flaring in her chest. She finally sat up, turning to glare at him. "I did my job. I did what the Navy trained me to do. I saved those Rangers." "I know you did," Hayes said, reaching out and tapping his thick finger against the armored receiver of her rifle. "But you're sitting here pretending you're made of the same steel this gun is made of. You're not. You bleed. You hurt. You barely sleep." Quinn looked away, staring out at the heat mirage. The anger evaporated as quickly as it had flared, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. "I met one of them," she confessed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "One of the Rangers from Charlie, down in the armory." Hayes stopped chewing his tobacco. "What did he say?" "He didn't know it was me," she said, wrapping her arms around her knees, pulling them tight against her chest. "He told me to thank the SEAL. He called me a ghost. He said I was a Tier 1 psycho." She let out a dry, humorless laugh that sounded like a cough. "They don't want a human being up on that ridge, Marcus. They want a monster. A monster can pull the trigger 22 times without flinching. A human being." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "A human being," Hayes finished for her, his voice gentle, "has to carry those ghosts home." Quinn looked back through the scope. The steel target was still wavering, distorted by the heat, a vague, shapeless thing. She reached out and closed the scope cap, plunging the glass into darkness. "Load up," she told Hayes. Her voice deadened again. "I've confirmed my 0. Let's get out of the sun." Night in the high desert didn't fall. It crashed. The blistering heat vanished the moment the sun dipped behind the jagged Hindu Kush, replaced by a biting, arid cold that seeped right through Kevlar and bone. Quinn sat on an overturned ammunition crate behind the housing units, a thick fleece jacket zipped up to her chin. The wind had shifted, carrying the acrid chemical stench of the FOB's burn pit. It smelled of melting plastic, diesel fuel, and incinerated medical waste. It was a vile, toxic perfume, but tonight she welcomed it. It overpowered the phantom smell of copper that had been clinging to the back of her throat for 4 days. A heavy set of boots crunched in the frozen gravel. Hayes stepped out from the shadows between the CHUs. He didn't say a word. He just handed her a chipped ceramic mug. Heat radiated through the thick sides, warming Quinn's stiff, freezing fingers. Black coffee. It tasted like scorched earth and battery acid, brewed in a pot that hadn't been washed since the invasion. It was perfect. Hayes sat down on the dirt next to her crate, pulling his knees up and wrapping his arms around them. They watched the orange glow of the burn pit, reflecting off the low-hanging clouds in the distance. "Riley got the dispatch," Hayes said softly, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Orders came down from Bagram. We're spinning up. Wheels up at 0500. Quinn took a slow, scalding sip of the coffee. "Where?" "Syria," Hayes grunted. "Another valley, another overwatch, same circus, different sand." She nodded once. It didn't matter where they were going. The math was the same everywhere. Gravity worked the same in Damascus as it did in Helmand. Wind was just moving air. Footsteps approached from the direction of the TOC. Commander Riley emerged into the dim, amber light of the perimeter sodium lamps. He wasn't wearing his plate carrier, just his faded uniform, but he looked heavier than he had this afternoon. He held a manila folder in his left hand. Riley stopped a few feet away, looking down at the two of them. He didn't offer a greeting. He just opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. "Clayton pushed it through fast," Riley said, his voice flat, devoid of the usual ceremonial cadence commanders used when discussing awards. "Usually takes 6 months to get a citation approved. He had it stamped by the Pentagon in 8 hours." He held the paper out to Quinn. She didn't reach for it. She stared at the crisp, white rectangle hovering in the cold air. It looked entirely alien in this environment of dirt, grease, and rust. "Take it, Chief," Riley said quietly. "It belongs in your jacket." Reluctantly, Quinn pulled one hand away from the warm mug and pinched the edge of the paper. It was stiff. The ink was slightly raised, laser-printed and pristine. She tilted it toward the amber light to read. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action, against an armed enemy of the United States, outstanding tactical proficiency, neutralizing 22 hostile combatants, saving the lives of 24 United States Army personnel." The words felt hollow. They were polished, bureaucratic terms designed to sanitize the visceral, deafening reality of what had actually happened. Neutralizing. It made it sound like turning off a light switch. It didn't capture the way a human body violently collapsed when struck by a 250-grain bullet. Tactical proficiency. It didn't mention the way she had vomited bile into the dirt after the 4th hour of looking through the scope, completely dehydrated and shaking from the recoil. "It reads like a movie script," Quinn whispered, her voice cracking in the dry cold. "That's what they need it to be," Riley replied, shoving his hands deep into his pockets. "They need the narrative. It justifies the budget. It justifies the flag-draped coffins. We do the dirty work in the dark, and they write a clean paragraph about it in the light." Quinn looked down at the bottom of the page. General Clayton's signature was scrawled aggressively across the signature block, in thick, black fountain pen ink. The man who had stood in the TOC and tried to humiliate her, who had looked at her like she was a stain on his immaculate military fantasy, had authorized her enshrinement as a hero. She folded the stiff paper in half, then in quarters. The sharp creases snapped loudly in the quiet night. "I'll put it with the others," she said, shoving the folded square into the thigh pocket of her cargo pants. Riley offered a tight, sympathetic nod. "Get your gear prepped. The C-17 is already on the tarmac. We board in 4 hours. He turned and walked back into the darkness. Hayes spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the frozen dirt. You know, if you pinned all your medals to your chest at once, you'd probably sink right to the bottom of the ocean. Quinn stared out at the glow of the burn pit. That's what an anchor does, Hayes. 4:30 hours. The FOB was aggressively awake. The flight line was a chaotic symphony of screaming turbine engines and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades beating the cold morning air into submission. The smell of JP-8 jet fuel was overpowering, coating the back of the throat with a slick, chemical taste. Quinn stood by the tail ramp of the massive grey C-17 Globemaster. She was fully geared up. The heavy plate carrier, the magazines, the radio, the medkit. It all locked onto her body like a familiar exoskeleton. The bruised, battered flesh of her shoulder throbbed angrily against the rigid ceramic strike plate. But she simply ignored the signal. She reached up and ran a thumb over the center of her chest. The trident was still there, tarnished, scratched, the gold plating wearing thin on the edges of the eagle's wings. It was heavy. It was a small piece of metal, but it carried the weight of the water she had swallowed in Coronado, the hypothermia she had endured, and the ledger she could never erase. It wasn't a fashion accessory. It was a receipt. Hayes slapped her shoulder as he walked past, lugging his massive drag bag up the ramp. "Let's go, Gallagher. Sand's getting into my dip." Quinn hoisted the heavy, custom-cut Pelican case containing her rifle. Her muscles protested, burning with fatigue, but she forced them to work. As she turned to walk up the ramp, a flatbed truck rumbled past on the tarmac, ferrying troops toward a waiting Blackhawk. It was the Ranger Unit, Charlie Company. They were battered. Several men were in slings. Others had fresh white bandages wrapped around heads and limbs. They looked exhausted, their faces pale beneath the dirt, staring blankly out at the flight line. Quinn stopped at the base of the ramp. On the edge of the flatbed sat Dawson. His arm was still heavily immobilized, the sling strapped tightly to his chest. He was staring at the ground, lost in whatever nightmare was playing out behind his eyes. The truck hit a seam in the concrete, jolting the passengers. Dawson looked up. His eyes scanned the tarmac and locked onto Quinn. He saw the heavy rifle case in her hand. He saw the battered plate carrier. He saw the sniper veil wrapped around her neck. And then his eyes drifted to the center of her chest. Even from 20 yards away, in the dim pre-dawn light, the gold of the trident caught the harsh glare of the halogen runway lamps. Dawson's brow furrowed. He blinked, his mind trying to connect the dots. The maintenance tech in the armory, the broken-down, massive rifle, the SEAL overwatch on the ridge, the ghost. Quinn didn't look away. She stood perfectly still amidst the swirling prop wash, holding his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't try to look tough. She just let him see her. The exhaustion, the hollowed-out eyes, the dirt, the bruised reality of the monster he had thanked. Dawson's posture changed. The confusion washed away, replaced by a sudden, stark realization. He didn't smile either. He didn't cheer, and he didn't salute. He just slowly, painfully raised his good hand and pressed it flat against his heart. A silent acknowledgement between the living and the person who had bought their lives with her own soul. The flatbed truck rolled past, carrying Dawson and the rest of Charlie Company out of sight, swallowed by the exhaust fumes and the dark. Quinn lowered her chin. The cold wind whipped a strand of greasy hair across her cheek. "Gallagher!" Hayes yelled from the top of the ramp, his voice barely cutting through the whine of the jet engines. "They're closing the door. Move your ass!" Quinn adjusted her grip on the heavy Pelican case. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel redeemed by the folded piece of paper sitting in her pocket, or by the general who had apologized. She was a weapon. She was a machine built by the Navy to apply violence from a distance, calculating the windage of human tragedy in 100 different deserts. And the machine still functioned. Quinn turned her back to the rising sun, put her head down, and walked up the metal ramp into the belly of the waiting aircraft, ready to do the math all over again. War doesn't breed flawless movie poster heroes. It breeds survivors who carry the unbearable weight of the math they had to do to keep others alive. Quinn's story isn't about the glory of the badge, but the heavy, bruising reality of what it actually costs to wear it. If this deep dive into the gritty, unseen psychological toll of the battlefield resonated with you, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates grounded, raw storytelling, and subscribe to the channel for more unvarnished, hard-hitting dramas. Your support keeps these stories alive.